Well, the origin for this New Testament biblical theology was in a course I began teaching in the late 1980s at Gordon Conwell Seminary. It was called the New Testament Theology, though in reality it was a New Testament biblical theology, which I'll elaborate on what that means in a moment. The course that I taught, I continued to teach at least every other year. When I went to Wheaton College Graduate School, I continued to teach this, and all along I was developing this and writing articles in various publications, journals, etc., developing this New Testament biblical theology as the course developed as well. And at Westminster Theological Seminary, I'm continuing to teach this sort of thing. Why am I calling this a New Testament biblical theology and not a New Testament theology? Of course, in past years, especially among evangelical authors, but others as well, there have been New Testament theologies. And so why am I making a difference with the title New Testament biblical theology? Well, in reality, this is fitting more into a German scene than an American scene. Peter Stuhlmacher and Hans Hubner both have volumes called A New Testament Biblical Theology, and their attempt, though they do this in different ways, is to try to understand the New Testament from its Old Testament background. Now, typical New Testament theologies will take each New Testament book, usually and roughly in its canonical order, and study the main themes in the book. Sometimes they'll do that inductively and summarize the themes at the end, or sometimes they'll discern the themes at the beginning and run those themes through each New Testament book. What I'm trying to do that's different, and by the way, it's different from Stuhlmacher and Hubner, because they also operate roughly canonically in the canonical order of the New Testament books. What I've done is to have a first major section after my introduction that's describing the difference between this book and other New Testament theologies. In the first substantial chapter, I have a thumbnail sketch of an Old Testament biblical theology in which I try to formulate an Old Testament redemptive historical storyline. And then I move into the New Testament and show how that storyline has been unfolded, even transformed. And then what structures the rest of the New Testament biblical theology is each part of that storyline becomes a chapter. So now within that chapter, I may sometimes operate more canonically and see how that theme works canonically. Sometimes I'll leave certain books out if the theme isn't found in the book. So mine is structured according to an Old Testament storyline unfolded into a New Testament storyline. And each part of that storyline then forms the topics for the rest of the chapter, the rest of the book. Now, so what I'm really saying is this, that the uniqueness of this book is to really see every major New Testament theological notion as having its roots in the Old Testament. And secondly, to see every major New Testament notion as an already and not yet end-time idea. So that what was foreshadowed and predicted in the Old has begun fulfillment, but not consummated fulfillment in the New. And one can certainly understand the New Testament without reading this book and using the Old Testament and already and not yet lenses that I have on. But I do believe that once you have these two lenses on, the major ideas of the New Testament are understood in more richness and deepness. So that is the main difference. Certainly some might see this, this is just an emphasis that's a little bit more than you find in other New Testament theologies, but actually I think that mine is more apples, the others are oranges. They weren't attempting to do what I'm doing, and I'm not attempting to do what they were doing. Their works are good in their own right. So that's the main difference. That's why I call this a New Testament biblical theology, because I'm trying to see the New Testament in the light, not just of the New Testament, but also in the light of the whole Old Testament, and then how those Old Testament ideas were developed in early Judaism, and then how the New Testament develops those ideas.